The Sassanian Empire, established in 224 AD, was one of the most formidable powers of the ancient world. Emerging from the ashes of the Parthian Arsacid dynasty, one of the Hellenistic kingdoms, it marked a sort of new era in Persian history, one defined by a centralized administration. Founded by Ardashir I after defeating the Parthian king Artabanus IV, the Sassanian dynasty sought to revive the glories of Cyrus the Great's Achaemenid Empire, the largest empire of the ancient world, and the kind of father figure of Persian culture. The Sassanians presided over a society structured around a rigid hierarchy. The king stood at the pinnacle, ruling as an agent of divine will, and he was supported by a bureaucracy and an aristocracy. This hierarchical structure extended into society, with nobles, priests, and warriors dominating the social order. Cities were built up under Sassanian rule, particularly Ctesiphon, the capital, which became a hub of commerce and culture. Part of this flourishing came from Sassanian contributions to the Silk Road trade network. Stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus River Valley, the empire linked Indian and Plateau Chinese cultures to the Byzantines and Caucasian peoples. And at the heart of the successful Sassanian state was the ancient religion of Zoroastrianism, the pre-Muslim faith of Persia. Rooted in the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, Zoroastrianism was a monotheistic religion. It sort of took the polytheistic ancient Persian religions and reformed them, which some scholars say was prompted by Western, perhaps even Jewish influence, though it's certainly debatable why exactly Zarathustra reformed the religion like so. In fact, it's just as likely that Judaism was influenced by Zoroastrian more so than vice versa, given the fact that both were developing at precisely the same time and in the same general region. Regardless, Zoroastrianism framed existence as essentially a struggle between Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness and chaos. This dichotomy was mirrored in the daily lives of Zoroastrians, who sought to uphold Asha, truth, and avoid Druj, falsehood. The ancient Greeks saw in Zoroastrianism the archetype of the dualist view of the world and of morality and human destiny, and supposed that the religion must have inspired the Chaldean doctrines of astrology and magic. The Christians, following a Jewish tradition, identified Ezekiel, Nimrod, and Seth as perhaps at least being influenced by Zoroastrianism, and Balaam to be a Zoroastrian prophet, though the figure of the prophet Balaam in the Bible isn't directly prescribed a faith. Anyway, the Sassanian kings embraced Zoroastrianism as a unifying force, intertwining it with governance much like medieval European societies would do with Christianity. The priestly class, or magi, wielded immense influence, shaping laws and social norms in accordance with religious principles. And yes, it is likely that the three magi who visited baby Jesus were Zoroastrians, as they are described as astrologists, a term often used in conflation with Zoroastrian priests and practitioners by the Greeks. Now, while the empire exhibited a degree of tolerance towards other religions, most notably Christianity, Judaism, and Manichaeism, there were periods of persecution, particularly against Christians, whose loyalties were often suspected to lie with the Byzantine Empire, the Sassanians' greatest rival. The Byzantine-Sassanian rivalry was really one of the most defining features of late antiquity. These two superpowers fought for control of the fertile regions of Mesopotamia, the highlands of Armenia, and the lucrative trade routes of the Levant or the Holy Land. The wars between the Byzantine and Sassanid empires were long and brutal, like the Anastasian War in the early 6th century and the Iberian War, referring to pre-Christian Georgia, not Spain and Portugal. Both empires inflicted heavy damage on each other, destabilizing their border regions, something that would come back to bite both of them within the century. Now, after these initial wars with Byzantium, under Khosrow II, the Sassanian Empire reached the zenith of its power. In a series of campaigns during the early 7th century, Sassanian forces captured Jerusalem, sacked Antioch, and even occupied Egypt, bringing the Byzantine Empire to the brink of collapse. But then the tide turned with the rise of Emperor Heraclius, who penetrated deep into Persian territory. The war ended in 628, leaving both empires exhausted, and this is where their fighting would come back to haunt both of the great powers. Just before the conclusion of the Byzantine Sassanid Wars in 622, the Hijra, or the migration of Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina, called Yathrib at the time, occurred. Now this established Muhammad as a political leader beyond just a prophet, and unified the Arab tribes, at least in this region, into a unified state. They then fought the Meccan Quraysh, and after the Battle of the Trench in 627, they signed the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. But then the Quraysh violated the treaty, leading Muhammad to march on Mecca and symbolically assert control over the whole of Arabia, rededicating the Kaaba to Allah. From there, with the Byzantines and the Sassanids weak, Muhammad sent envoys to persuade their rulers to convert to Islam. When neither accepted, Muhammad began military encounters with Byzantine forces in the Jordanian desert and began to expand northward. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632 AD, Islam had transformed into a powerful political and religious force, elected Abu Bakr, one of Muhammad's closest companions, as the first caliph, which translates to successor. This was the beginning of the Rashidun Caliphate, and a political struggle in Islam that lasts to this day over the vetting of the true caliph, or successor to Muhammad. Following Abu Bakr's ascension, several Arab tribes that had pledged allegiance to him renounced their loyalty, refusing to pay taxes, claiming allegiance to new prophets such as Musaylimah, Sajah, and Tulayha. The wars of apostasy that followed solidified Abu Bakr's dominion over Arabia, and led to the compiling of the Quran in written form. With the Caliphate now free to turn back to the north, under Khalid ibn al-Walid, one of Islam's greatest generals, Muslim forces launched their first raids into Sassanian territory in 633, targeting Mesopotamia. The earliest incursions were not full-scale invasions, but rather exploratory campaigns that intended to test Sassanian defenses and create a foothold for Muslim forces. Their successes set the stage for the rapid Muslim conquests of the 7th century, wherein the Caliphate managed to fully take advantage of the vulnerabilities of both the Byzantines and the Sassanids. They launched a series of campaigns that literally dismantled the Sassanian state within about 2 decades. The Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 marked the downfall of the Sassanian Empire, and showing little resistance, Sassanian forces were swiftly defeated, opening the heart of their empire to invasion. In 642, at the Battle of Nahavand, or the Victory of Victories, the Sassanians suffered another crushing loss. Yezdegerd III, the last Sassanian king, fled into Central Asia and was eventually assassinated in 651, ending his dynasty. What followed was essentially small campaigns of guerrilla resistance, which were slowly destroyed. Because of the feudal structure of the Sassanian Empire, noble families like the Parthians struck deals with the Arabs rather than fighting them, and with that, Zoroastrianism too began to fall. The priesthood had recently alienated segments of the population, while early Islam's egalitarian message and promise of divine salvation caused Islam to quickly, almost immediately, supplant Zoroastrianism across almost the entirety of Persia. Of course, some Zoroastrian communities survived, retreating to isolated regions like Yazd and Kerman, while others migrated to India, where they became known as Parsis. Other Persian nobles fled to the Tang dynasty, where they were accepted into the court and military, and certainly some of the cultural contributions of the Sassanians lived on. The Islamic caliphates adopted and adapted many aspects of Sassanian governance, administration, and culture. Persian literature, art, and science influenced the Islamic Golden Age and Islamic astronomy and math. But of course, eventually Zoroastrianism was simply reduced to a minor religion, while the Caliphate expanded and expanded all the way to Spain and North Africa and Anatolia, slowly crippling the Byzantine Empire into a shell of its former Roman glory. After a while, in the 18th century, the Safavids forcefully converted Persia to Shia Islam, creating Iran, which, in various forms, existed up until about the end of the Second World War. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, there was something of a Zoroastrian reconquista, which drove Islam out of Persia. Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, consider joining the channel or submitting a scenario in our official Discord server linked below. Also, be sure to check out the new stickers that we just dropped on our merch store. I personally designed these stickers and I'm very happy with the results, and buying one helps to support more content like this. Anyway, thanks and enjoy the video. In 1492, as Columbus was busy sailing the ocean blue, the Catholic monarchs of Spain ended 780 years of Muslim rule in Al-Andalus, expelling 3 million Muslims and ending the Crusades. The Christian Spaniards had held out for 7 centuries in the mountainous, rugged terrain of the northern parts of the Iberian Peninsula in order to launch this reconquest of their homeland, and their success was a huge deal for Christian Europe. Anyway, there are some interesting parallels that we can actually draw between the situation the Spaniards and the Portuguese were in and that of the Zoroastrian Persians. Both had mountainous, rugged, near impassable northeastern border regions. Both were invaded by an Islamic caliphate. Both had their own religions, which were suppressed. But only the Spanish managed to push out the invaders, whereas the Persians simply succumbed to their fate and became integrated into the Islamic world. So why was that? Well, for starters, Persia is closer to the Arabian heartland than Iberia, meaning Muslim reinforcements would arrive very quickly to give the Zoroastrian insurrections a quick death. And on top of that, the Caliphate, while it had conquered Persia, was much smaller than it was during the time of the Reconquista. A larger empire is of course harder to control, and the early Caliphate only had to deal with Arabia, Mesopotamia, and some conquered Sassanid and Byzantine lands, unlike the expansive later Caliphate. Furthermore, unlike the Spaniards, the Zoroastrians lacked the support of a massive continental religious authority like the papacy. The papacy's influence allowed the Reconquista to receive help from the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, who sent French, Italian, and German forces to aid the Spanish and recaptured Barcelona himself. Christian Sicilians also joined the fight, and although this isn't an example of papal power, the Berbers in modern-day Morocco helped to push the Caliphate out of parts of the Maghreb, sealing off Spain after they won, so they didn't have to continually defend themselves from the Caliphate pushing back. By contrast, the Zoroastrians didn't have this sort of continent-spanning power, meaning other nations would see little to no interest in supporting them. Furthermore, conversion to Islam was very rapid for many Persians. Zoroastrianism, in its various forms, didn't produce the kind of zeal that followers of Islam had, and astrology was very influential within Zoroastrianism at that time, leading many to believe that the Islamic conquest was preordained in the stars, and that resistance was pointless. But I think that we can wave away at least some of these problems. Not only is it always inherently possible that Zoroastrianism can reform or evolve in some way, just like European Christianity did during the Gregorian reforms or even the much later Protestant Reformation, and beyond this, Zoroastrianism also has a very important eschatological tradition. Eschatology concerns essentially the study of the end of days. In Zoroastrianism, there is an eschatological figure called the Sassanids, or the one who brings benefit, who is essentially an almost messianic figure who brings about Prerequisites, the final renovation of the world in which evil is destroyed. The term applied to 3 savior figures that were prophesied to progressively bring about the final renovation, and these are called the 3 Sassanids, or Sassanids. The first 2 are Oshetar and Oshetarma, who are all posthumous sons of Zoroaster, and the third is simply referred to as the third Sassanid. It was said that one will appear at the end of the 3 last millennia of the world. If we follow Zoroastrian tradition, then Oshetar lived around 1 AD, about the same time as the birth of Christ, and Oshetarma would thus appear between 500 and 1500 AD, which is right around the time of the Arab conquests, which ended in 750 AD. Now this is obviously a bit of a stretch, as the dates don't line up perfectly, but Even still, it is plausible to imagine an alternate timeline in which the arrival of Islam and the devastation of the Sassanian Empire are reinterpreted within Zoroastrian theology not as preordained by the stars, but as signs of an impending battle between the forces of Asha and Druj. In this way, the surviving Sassanian rulers, Zoroastrian priesthood, and a core of loyalist military forces could retreat into the mountainous Central Asian lands, some of them even fleeing to the Caspian regions, areas that historically resisted Islamic dominance for far longer than the Persian heartland, and rally under a charismatic leader who adopts the mantle of the Oshetarma, proclaiming themselves the divinely ordained savior destined to initiate the first phase of the world's ultimate renewal. Such a figure, whether a genuine believer or politically astute opportunist, could unify scattered Zoroastrians and even just anti-Caliphate forces, whether they be Christian or pagan, and inspire them with the belief that they are part of a holy mission to restore the Persian heartland. One such figure that could take up this mantle might be that of Peros III, or his son Nasir, also known as Naresh. Peros was born the Prince of the Sassanians in 636, after the Arab conquests had already begun, and he was very, very young when his father, Yazdegerd III, the last king of kings of the Sassanid Empire, died at just 27 years old. Peros and the imperial family escaped the Muslim conquests through the Pamir Mountains in what is now Tajikistan, where they arrived in China, which was under the rule of the Tang dynasty. The Tang dynasty actually heavily supported the Sassanians, and this is because the Sassanian Empire relied upon and protected the Silk Road trade routes that connected China, Central Asia, Persia, Anatolia, and Europe. Tang dynasty records, such as the Jiu Tang Shu, the Old Book of Tang, mention frequent diplomatic exchanges between the Tang court and the Sassanians. Persian envoys brought pearls, textiles, and gems to the Tang capital of Chang'an, while the Chinese reciprocated with silk, porcelain, and paper. Tang-era art and textiles show Persian-inspired designs like winged lions and floral patterns, because the Chinese actually held a great respect for the Sassanians, with the Tang court regarding the Persian Empire as a peer civilization, something that some of you may recognize as an incredible feat, especially given that the later Qing dynasty would not even afford this title to European powers like the mighty British Empire. While Yazdegerd III, Peros' father, fled into Central Asia, he first found refuge among the Hephthalites, or the White Huns, and upon arriving in Tang China, he and the other Persian refugees were accepted and immediately integrated into Chinese society in noble and powerful roles, often as generals or ministers of different economic affairs, due to that previous trade relationship along the Silk Road. Many of these Persians, who were given esteemed titles in the Tang military, then helped exert Chinese control over Central Asia and fight back the Tibetans and the Turks. But of course, all of this friendliness and the Chinese understanding of how valuable and strategic the Persians are and their empire were begged the question, why didn't the Tang dynasty simply help the Persians reclaim their homeland from the Muslims? Now, the first and most self-explanatory explanation is that the former Sassanian Empire was located far, far west of Tang China, beyond the Central Asian steppe and deserts. Coordinating a military campaign across such vast distances with limited supply lines and communication, because keep in mind, the only reason trade was even possible in this region was because of a huge network of independent merchants, not mapped out routes from coastal China all the way to Constantinople. So a military march through these regions would have been nearly impossible, and probably a significant waste of resources, leaving the Sassanians and Chinese with a weak and battered army upon arriving in Persia. Beyond that, the Tang's primary focus was on securing their closer frontier regions, such as the Tarim Basin and Hexi Corridor, which were right on their doorstep. The Tang faced the Tibetan Empire and the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, and later the Western Turkic Khaganate, which dominated the lands to their direct south, north, and west. If they tried to move military resources into Central Asia, they'd not only be leaving the Tang heartland under-defended, but would also be completely surrounded by enemies on all sides as they moved. Beyond this, the Tang had some big issues at home, like the Liyuan rebellion from 617 to 618 AD, and they couldn't afford, nor would they probably be willing to, stretch their resources to this distant Persian front. Now, according to the old Book of Tang, Peroz actually did indeed ask for military help from Tang China against the Arabs in 661. The Tang court created the Area Command of Persia on the modern border of Afghanistan in Iran, with Peroz as commander-in-chief. In early 662, he was named King of Persia by the Tang dynasty. But Peroz didn't actually rule over any land within what could be considered Persia at all. In fact, he didn't rule over land at all, but instead commanded essentially the border guards of China along this chunk of the western frontier. The title King of Persia was nothing more than an honorary one, and eventually, after his service on the area front, he was returned to the court and received the title of Great General of the Right Militant Guard. After that, he fought for the Tang in Central Asia, and was given the title of Awe-Inspiring General of the Left Flank Guards, before then passing away in 678. As you could probably tell, the Tang dynasty's approach to supporting the Persians was really just to say, yeah, you guys can go over there, I guess, but you still report back to us, and we'll give you boatloads of money and prestige and palaces. And while it might seem like China was just using these Persian generals, by about 664, most of them were actually content with their situation and had all but abandoned any notion of returning to liberate Persia proper. Peroz's son, Narsieh, hostage of the imperial court, wrote about its father in Chinese, saying, Peroz requested only a simple burial, and the Chinese emperor approved. The entire exiled court was in attendance, along with the Chinese emperor himself. The Chinese emperor held Peroz's shaking hands. Peroz looked west and said, I have done what I could for my homeland, and I have no regrets. Then he looked east and said, I am grateful to China, my new homeland. Then he looked at his immediate family and all the Persians in attendance and said, contribute your talents and devote it to the emperor. We are no longer Persians, we are now Chinese. Then he died peacefully. A beautiful horse was made to gallop around his coffin 33 times before burial, because this was the number of military victories he had during his lifetime. Peroz was a great Chinese general and a great Persian prince, devoted and loyal to his people. Alright, so we've talked a lot about why this scenario probably wouldn't be possible. But let's actually get into what would happen if it somehow was. We're going to be moving forward under a couple premises. The first assumption being that a large subsect of the Sassanian elite, the Zoroastrian priesthood, and a viable amount of military resources managed to escape the Muslim conquests into the border regions with the Tang in Central Asia. We'll also assume that they reside in Tang China, but do not, in fact, give up their Persian identity nor their aim to reconquer their homeland. We'll also sort of work under the assumption that there is some sort of religious component to this, with the priesthood at least intact, and perhaps they're simply waiting for the second Saoshyant Oshitarma to lead them to reclaim the homeland. It is written that one of the Persians was granted permission to build a temple near the imperial court, and while we don't know for sure whether it was a Christian or Zoroastrian temple, this does give us enough of a notion that the Chinese were willing to let the Persians retain their religious customs even while in China. I think the most plausible time for this Persian contingent holding out in western China to strike back would be in 747 during the Third Fitna and the beginning of the Abbasid rebellion. Of course, during this rebellion, the majority of Persian land was still in Muslim hands, except for the regions of Gilan, Dailam, Tabaristan, and Gorgan. But this would leave the Arabs distracted in the Levant, and give the Persians a great opportunity to strike from the east, at least with supplies from the Chinese, if not perhaps military reinforcements, and maybe strike a significant enough blow at the Caliphate to rally the other pockets of resistance against the Arabs. And there is actually a pretty wide array of other groups that might contribute to this campaign. On the less realistic side of things, we have the Oghuz Turks, who might ally with the Persians in exchange for land grants. And Turkic horse archers could certainly be a game changer in these mountainous regions, but I doubt the Persians would really want to sacrifice territory in exchange for their help. And the Turks might not want to ally with an ally of the Chinese, who they're not on great terms with. The Persians can always hire mercenaries from these Turkic groups in Central Asia, but mercenaries aren't always the best play when fighting a holy war. Then there's also the question of maybe the Indian Zoroastrians, the Parsis, who set sail from Persia and landed in Gujarat, India in the mid-780s. These Parsis, though, would still be in Persia during the Third Fitna, not in India yet, because the migration hadn't occurred yet, and they would still be under Islamic domination at this time, perhaps not with the wherewithal to launch a significant resistance movement. Along with these Zoroastrians in southeastern Persia, there would also be the Zoroastrians living in the Caspian regions, like the powerful Daylamite precursors to Mardavish ibn Ziyar, the founder of the Ziyarid dynasty. So essentially, this would be the equivalent of Charlemagne rallying the Spanish kingdoms, the Caspian kingdoms, to push out the Andalusians, or the Arabs, coming in from a foreign land, gaining the support of the existing remnants of pre-Islamic Persia and driving the Caliphate out. So let's explore this scenario. We'll say, perhaps, that a prominent Persian noble, maybe one of, or maybe even all of the sons of Narsieh, all of whom were married into the Chinese nobility, would, upon hearing of the Third Fitna, launch a campaign to retake Persia. They would likely have a significant contingent of Chinese soldiers, along with that of the Persians, and maybe we can assume they hired some Turkic mercenaries on horseback with silver or some other valuable resource, and make their way to the lands just north of Muslim Persia. Now, I know you're probably thinking a few things, and yes, information about the Third Fitna probably wouldn't travel that fast, and they'd probably lose a lot of soldiers on the way there, but for the sake of this scenario, we'll just kind of ignore these factors. The sons would, upon arriving close to the Persian plateau, split the army in two, with one contingent beginning an attack from the east, while the other would send messengers to the Daylamites and Tabaristan and Gilan, who would then make their way to join this main army headed towards the city of Daylam. In 2 years, the Eastern Army would take Shamidan, Kassin, Dakhman, Bistam, Bihar, and Siman with relative ease, and would thus shift its focus towards Ray, which is now Tehran. Ray was the most important city in Muslim Persia, as it held the largest population and fertile farmland stretching across multiple rivers. The Western Army would keep the already quite overstretched Arab forces from reinforcing Ray, and while the city would close its gate and prevent an immediate siege from the Eastern Army, eventually the threat of starvation would lead the population to rebel against their Arab rulers, and the Eastern Army would enter the city victorious. The capture of Ray would give the armies a foothold in the Persian plateau, and begin the Narsieh dynasty of Persia, which will assume the Daylamites, Tabaristanis, and Gilan swear alliance to. This would mark the beginning of the Fatah Majad, or the Zoroastrian reconquest. Alright, so there's a lot to speculate about here, and there are plenty of directions that we can take this world after this Zoroastrian reconquista. We could see the Narsieh dynasty reclaim the Persian plateau and perhaps forge very close relations with the Chinese, again because the sons of Narsieh married into Chinese nobility, and thus we would kind of have some sort of a situation like the Parthians, not in that there are Greeks ruling Persia, but in that there are like Persian Chinese people ruling Persia by this time. Now, if this relationship between Tang China and the Narsieh dynasty is formed, this would sort of create a joint Persian-Chinese zone of influence across Central Asia that would widen the Silk Road, so to speak, and alleviate China's struggles with the Turkic and Tibetan raids. Now, we could also see something of a confederation of semi-independent states, kind of like the Holy Roman Empire, emerge out of the different and, by this point, somewhat unique Zoroastrian and Muslim populations of Persia, whereby governance would fall more to the regional level, and the Caspian kingdoms would probably end up the most powerful within this coalition. Either way, the Persians are going to face resistance from the converted populations of Persia, and they're going to have to also deal with the Arabs once the Arabs have finished putting down the Third Fitna and redirect their attention to Persia once again. The Muslims could quickly mobilize huge armies, and that's something that neither the Persians nor the Tang can really do to protect this new Persian state, in whatever form it is, from simply being reconquered in return. Now, there's always the question of a Byzantine-Persian alliance, but I do think that this notion really forgets the huge rivalry that existed for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, between the Byzantines or Romans and the Sassanids or Persians. But I guess things can change, and perhaps a bit of opportunism or realpolitik from the rulers of both empires could foster a sort of alliance, if not a temporary one. I mean, we have seen huge rivalries be overcome by mutual enemies throughout history, Austria and the Ottomans in World War I, or more recently Japan and Korea to combat Chinese influence, or even the Romans and Greeks during the Seleucid Wars. So the alliance doesn't have to be permanent, but the combating of a more powerful mutual enemy can often motivate rivals to cozy up with one another. Now, there are some other interesting side effects of a Zoroastrian reconquista. If Zoroastrianism, perhaps having reformed while abroad due to Chinese influence, or the shock of Islamic domination, or even Islamic influence while in the general Persian population, if it can manage to reassert a dominant role in Iran, we might end up with an even wackier religious map than we have today. And that's because throughout history, Zoroastrian and Christian theology actually had a bit of an overlap, quite a bit of an overlap, leading many Zoroastrians to convert to Christianity once the Eastern Roman Empire temporarily conquered Mesopotamia. All that is to say, the Christians could easily take advantage of this situation to spread their religion east in this newly forming Persian dynasty. Ironically, during the 700s and 800s, Christianity was actually spreading west, converting the Celts and northern Germanic peoples to Christianity through missions and pilgrimages. But this force could very easily be turned also east, subverting the Islamic zeal with a Christian one, and even traveling along the Silk Road to China. Christian missions in China were already underway during this period, mostly from Nestorians who wanted to escape persecution from Rome and Constantinople. The Nestorians believed that Christ was two persons inhabiting one body, and that his divine and human natures were independent, and this was declared a heresy during the councils of Ephesus in 431 AD and Chalcedon in 451 AD. So many Nestorians simply migrated east and often found refuge with the Persians. In 781, the Xingqiao stele, known as the Nestorian stele, was erected to commemorate the propagation of Nestorian Christianity in China. And in this alternate scenario, with something of a wider Silk Road and without essentially a Muslim wall between the East and West, Christianity, both in its Nestorian and non-heretical forms, would make its way into Central Asia, into China, into Tibet, and maybe even into India or Japan. It's obvious that Christianity would be adapted and changed based on the regions it was introduced to, but historical precedent does tell us, in fact, that when given the resources and without a powerful political authority persecuting it, Christianity spread incredibly fast when introduced to East Asian civilizations. For example, in 635 AD, Nestorian missionaries led by Alo Pen were welcomed by Emperor Caizong. The emperor issued an edict of toleration, allowing Nestorian Christianity to establish itself in the Tang capital. Also, during the late Qing period, Christianity was reintroduced by Europeans who came to trade with the Chinese. By the early 20th century, Christianity had millions of adherents in China. Protestant missionaries translated the Bible into vernacular Chinese and used Confucian principles to frame Christian teachings. Christian schools and universities such as Yanqing University became centers of learning for both Christian and non-Christian Chinese. But of course, the rise of nationalism and anti-foreign sentiment in the 20th century, coupled with both the earlier Taiping Rebellion and the much later communist persecution after 1949, curbed the growth of Christianity. Despite this, the religion has survived and even experienced a resurgence in modern China, with estimates of tens of millions of Chinese Christians today. Besides just China, in 1549 AD, Japanese people were rapidly converted by Jesuit missionaries led by Francis Xavier. Arriving during the Warring States period when Japan lacked a unified central authority, Christianity flourished and began to outpace Buddhism in Japan. Within a few decades, tens of thousands of Japanese converted to Christianity, and by 1600, estimates suggest that there were 300,000 Japanese Christians, including many in the samurai class and among influential daimyo or feudal lords, until the shogunate began to crack down and completely outlaw Christianity. Even then, tens of thousands of Japanese Christians practiced in secret, known as Kirishitan. Getting back to the west, or the Near East, I guess. If we assume that somehow the Caliphate is seriously pushed back by the Persians, or the Byzantines, or both, and for whatever reason don't see a huge resurgence like we'd expect from powerful Muslim armies, we might end up with a more multipolar Islamic world, with regional dynasties like the Umayyads of Spain or the Fatimids in North Africa rising sooner and more dominantly, leaving the Abbasids or other caliphates to refocus more on consolidating their power in Mesopotamia, Arabia, and the Levant, and abandoning Central Asia and Persia to local powers. This could also push the Abbasids to focus on naval power, and lead to a more Muslim Southeast Asia and Indian subcontinent, ironically enough. We could also see the Persians innovate militarily, combining their traditional heavy cavalry cataphracts with horse archers inspired by the Turks, and possibly even Tang military techniques like the use of crossbows. These innovations would influence not only medieval warfare in the Near East, but could easily spread to Europe, reshaping the balance of power on the Eurasian continent when the Mongols or Turks arrived to challenge European kingdoms in the medieval period. So really, there's a ton that can happen. Not enough to talk about in a YouTube video, but that should tell us something about both Persia, but also late antiquity and the early medieval era. The Persians were always the bridge between the East and the West, the facilitators of the transmission of ideas, technology, and religion between the Mediterranean world and East Asia. And while we usually think of globalization as being tied to the age of exploration, or the colonial period, or the modern information age, all of this should remind us that the ancient and medieval worlds were profoundly interconnected. They say all roads lead to Rome, but in reality, at least in late antiquity and the early medieval era, all roads led to Persia. The Tang, Byzantium, and Sassanian Persia operated in a global economy that was arguably just as complex as a modern computer, with each individual merchant, road, route, city, religion, and empire all working together to maintain a continent-spanning network of commerce hundreds and thousands of times larger than they could individually perceive. And that's truly something you'll only find in the story of humanity. But as always, let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.